Branch 1, Core Idea. Remembering what matters. The first big branch of the mind map is all about resetting expectations around memory and learning. Instead of chasing the impossible goal of remembering everything, this branch argues that the real win is remembering what you actually need, well enough to use it in reasoning and problem solving. It contrasts the common obsession with more input, reading faster, watching more, binging content, with the neglected but crucial side of digestion, where you actually process, structure, and encode what you took in so it sticks. From the very beginning, the map frames learning as a two-stage process, consumption and digestion, that must stay in balance if you want your effort to turn into long-term, usable knowledge, rather than quick forgetting. Branch 2, Pacer Overview, the 5 types of information. The second major branch introduces the Pacer framework, which sits at the center of the whole system. Here, information is split into 5 categories: procedural, analogous, conceptual, evidence, and reference. The key message is that each type needs its own best-fit processing method, and that using the wrong one is a big reason people forget or feel like studying is a slog. The branch also links Pacer back to the earlier idea of passive reading, pointing out that when you don't distinguish between types of information, you end up rereading, zoning out, and reaching the end of a page with no idea what you just read. Sub-branch 2.1, Why Categorizing Matters. This sub-branch spells out why Pacer isn't just a fancy label. It explains that if you treat all information the same, by underlining everything, rereading everything, or summarizing everything, you waste a ton of time. Some information demands hands-on practice, others need deep comparison to what you already know, and others just need to be captured and reviewed later. By labeling what you're looking at as P, A, C, E, or R while reading, you instantly know what to do next. Practice, critique, map, store, and rehearse, or just store for recall. The whole system becomes a way to prevent random, unstructured study time and replace it with targeted, deliberate learning moves. Branch 3, Procedural Information. How-to and practice. The third major branch dives into procedural information, which is all the how-to stuff, techniques, methods, and step-by-step processes. This includes things like how to perform a clinical exam, how to use a particular coding pattern, or how to pronounce words in a new language. The mind map emphasizes that this type of information is action-based and doesn't truly sink in just by reading about it. It exists to be done, not just to be written in notes. Sub-branch 3.1, Targeted Process, Practice. In this sub-branch, the recommended process for procedural information is laid out very clearly. You need to practice as soon as possible after exposure. Instead of reading a how-to chapter and promising yourself you'll try it later, you're encouraged to apply the steps immediately in a real or realistic context. The text warns against the trap of reading, highlighting, and writing lots of notes on procedures without actually attempting them, because by the time you finally try, most of the detail has already faded. The system pushes you to see practice as non-negotiable digestion for this type. Sub-branch 3.2, Time Constraints and Overeating Analogy. Another sub-branch addresses what to do when you can't practice right now. The rule is surprisingly strict. If you can't digest a procedure by practicing it, either switch to another type of material you can process properly or pause consumption altogether. The mind map uses the analogy of overeating. Consuming tons of procedural content without practice is like stuffing yourself with food your body never gets the chance to digest, so it eventually just vomits it out, which is the mental equivalent of forgetting almost everything. This branch ties back to the global theme that every unit of consumption needs a matching dose of digestion. Branch 4, Analogous Information, Connections you can critique. The next major branch is analogous information, which is all about recognizing when something new reminds you of something you already know. Here, the focus is on spotting similarities between new content and prior knowledge. A muscle contraction reminds you of a swimming stroke. A new problem-solving method feels like an old one, or a tricky concept mirrors a hobby or life experience. This is presented as one of the easiest types of information to leverage because your brain already has a starting point. Sub-branch 4.1, Targeted process, critique of analogies. This sub-branch goes beyond just make analogies and stresses critiquing them. Rather than stopping at this is like that, you're invited to ask how exactly they are similar, where they differ, and in what situations the analogy breaks down. You're also encouraged to refine, extend, or even replace weak analogies to make them more accurate. This isn't just a nice mental trick. It forces deeper thinking and creates stronger links in your knowledge network, which in turn improves understanding and memory. Sub-branch 4.2. Analogies as subsets of other types of ideas. Another sub-branch explains that analogous information isn't its own isolated category. It can sit inside procedural or conceptual information. For example, you can use an analogy to make a procedure easier to remember or to reshape how you organize a concept on your mind map. The mind map suggests that while reading, you stay alert for these potential analogies and decide where they belong, either embedded in your map, attached to a procedure, or just stored mentally as a way to think about that topic. Branch 5. Conceptual information. What things are and how they link. The next major branch deals with conceptual information, the what and why layer of knowledge. This includes definitions, principles, theories, and the relationships between ideas. In most academic and scientific subjects, this is where much of the learning effort goes, understanding how things work, how ideas connect, and how they can be applied. The map highlights that real problem solving almost always needs both conceptual and procedural knowledge together. Sub-branch 5.1. Targeted process. Mapping, nonlinear notes. Here, the recommended process is to use mapping, especially mind maps or other nonlinear note styles. Instead of taking notes as one long list or paragraph, you pull out key ideas, arrange them as branches, and then grow sub-branches for details and relationships. This mirrors how an expert's knowledge is actually stored, as a network that can be entered at any point, not as a fixed sequence of lines. Mapping forces you to ask how each idea links to another, which makes your understanding more flexible and robust. Sub-branch 5.2. Practical use of maps and time issues. This sub-branch walks through how mapping fits into reading in practice. You pause to sketch out the main ideas, add new branches as you go, reorganize when something clicks, and sometimes attach analogies as branches. It also hammers home the idea that if you don't have time to map, that's a sign to slow your reading down, not to push through more chapters. If you keep consuming conceptual information without mapping or some other form of deep processing, you'll mostly forget it and only burden your future self with the need to relearn it later. Branch 6. Evidence information. Concrete support for concepts. The next branch defines evidence information as the detailed content that makes concepts concrete. Dates, statistics, case examples, and technical details that you use to support or illustrate bigger ideas. This kind of information is powerful in essays, explanations, and exam answers because it shows not just that you know a concept, but that you can back it up with specifics. However, the map makes it clear that evidence sits on top of a conceptual foundation. It's not meant to replace understanding. Sub-branch 6.1. Targeted process, store during reading. The first part of the process for evidence is to store it as you encounter it. While reading, as soon as you spot an important example or data point, you capture it in your system, maybe by adding it to your mind map, a second brain app, or a list of notes. The emphasis here is on quick, efficient capture, rather than full memorization on the spot. You want to avoid the trap of rereading the same paragraph endlessly, in the hope that the numbers or dates will magically stay in your head. Sub-branch 6.2. Targeted process. Rehearse later by using. The second part is rehearsal, which happens separately from the initial reading. Rehearsal here means actively using the evidence in realistic ways. Solving problems where that piece is needed, writing arguments or explanations that rely on it, or teaching it to someone else. The idea is that when you practice using evidence in the same way you'll need it in real life or in exams, it becomes far easier to recall and integrate smoothly into your thinking. Branch 7. Reference information. Raw details for recall. The next major branch is reference information, the most detail-heavy but conceptually light category. These are the tiny, specific details, exact constants, gene names, weird variable names in code, or long lists of attributes that don't really change your understanding, but may be necessary to know or recall accurately later. The mind map stresses that this type of information is mostly about recall, not deep reasoning. Subbranch 7.1. Targeted process. Store and rehearse with recall tools. The process here looks similar to evidence on the surface. Store and rehearse, but with a slightly different focus. You're encouraged to toss these details into flashcards or another recall-focused system and then rely on active recall and spaced repetition to keep them alive. Instead of trying to hold everything in your head while you read, you offload the details into a structure that regularly quizzes you and strengthens memory over time. Subbranch 7.2. What not to do with reference info. This subbranch repeats a recurring warning. Do not sit there rereading lists of reference items, trying to force them into your short-term memory in one long session. That approach burns time and mental energy and steals attention from deeper work on procedural, analogous, and conceptual information. By treating reference items as recall tasks to be handled by a flashcard-like system, you protect your limited focus for the more impactful types of learning. Branch 8. Global Balancing Principle and System-Level Insights. Another major branch zooms back out to the big picture principle behind the whole system. Consumption and digestion must stay in balance. It describes the common failure mode where people binge on lectures, articles, and videos without structured processing, leading to extremely high forgetting rates despite huge time investments. The mind map frames Pacer as a practical way to avoid that trap by tying every chunk of content to a specific next action that performs the digestion. Subbranch 8.1. Why the system feels unnatural. This subbranch explains why using Pacer can feel forced or unnatural at first. Human brains have hard limits on how much they can encode at once, but modern life constantly pushes us to consume more information than we can handle. Because of that mismatch, a structured, unnatural system is actually what keeps learning sustainable, especially if your goal is to reach a high level of knowledge in a reasonable time frame. The message is that feeling some friction when you start using Pacer is a sign you're finally pushing back against that overload. Branch 9. Kim Peek's story and the real learning goal. The final big branch uses the story of Kim Peek to drive home the core message. Kim had extraordinary memory abilities and could recall books and maps in astonishing detail, yet he struggled with reasoning and problem solving. The mind map uses this to show that raw memory, even superhuman memory, doesn't automatically translate into high-level performance. Especially in higher education and in real life, what matters more is the ability to reason, solve problems, and apply knowledge. Subbranch 9.1. Remembering everything versus remembering what matters. The closing subbranch ties the Kim Peek story back to the first branch of the mind map. If an exam or task only tests low-level recall, a person with perfect memory will win. But for university, postgraduate work, and real-world problem-solving, the edge goes to people who have built strong conceptual networks, practiced procedures, refined analogies, and learned to use evidence and reference details intelligently. The Pacer system is built around that reality. The point isn't to become a walking database, but to consistently remember what actually matters for the kind of thinking and work you care about.